What happens when the perfect life shatters in the most unimaginable way? For Camille Hartley, her 15th wedding anniversary was meant to be a celebration of a life built on love and trust. She had everything: a sprawling mansion, a billionaire husband, and two wonderful children. But when she came home early to surprise him, she found the surprise was on her. In her own bedroom, a strange woman stood before the mirror, draped in the one thing that was sacred: Camille's own wedding dress. And when her husband uttered 5 words that would ignite a war, honestly, she wears it better. It wasn't just a marriage that ended, it was a battle for survival that began. The late afternoon sun of October 12th cast long, golden fingers across the manicured lawns of the Hartley estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn and money, a combination so familiar it had its own scent memory for Camille Hartley. From the supple leather of the passenger seat in her obsidian Range Rover, she watched the imposing wrought iron gates of her home glide open, a silent, mechanized welcome she'd witnessed thousands of times. 15 years. Today marked 15 years since she had stood opposite Richard Hartley, her eyes reflecting his, both of them young, hungry, and impossibly in love. He was a brilliant tech innovator with fire in his eyes then. Now, he was a billionaire whose empire cast a shadow over entire industries. She had been there for every all-nighter, every gamble, every dizzying ascent. Her fingers traced the sharp, perfect edges of the small, heavy box from Tiffany's resting on her lap. Inside lay a vintage Patek Philippe watch, a 1971 Calatrava model from the year he was born. It had cost a staggering amount, enough to fund a startup, but the price was incidental. It was a symbol of time, the invaluable time they'd shared, the time she prayed they still had ahead. A way to say, "I remember you," before you were Richard Hartley the Titan. I remember the man. Lately time had felt strange, warped and stretched thin like old elastic. Richard was more distant than ever, a planet slowly drifting out of her orbit. His explanations for late nights and last-minute weekend trips had become a smokescreen of corporate jargon she knew he used to deflect and condescend. A critical synergy meeting in Singapore, he'd say, his tone implying she couldn't possibly grasp the complexities. Urgent due diligence on a Frankfurt acquisition. He used to be an open book, every page filled with shared dreams. Now, he was a heavily redacted document, entire chapters of his life blacked out. Just last month, at the Children's Hospital benefit she had chaired, he'd shown up late and spent the entire evening on his phone, a tight, unreadable expression on his face. When she'd gently touched his arm, he'd flinched almost imperceptibly, but she had felt it like a static shock. The driver, a stoic man named Thomas, who had been with them for a decade and had driven her children to their first days of school, pulled up the sweeping circular driveway. The crunch of gravel under the tires was a sound of arrival of sanctuary. But today, it sounded like grinding teeth. "Will Mr. Hartley be joining you for dinner?" Mrs. Hartley Thomas asked, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Pity, awkwardness. He looked away too quickly. She'd noticed the staff had been different lately too, averting their eyes, speaking in hushed tones when she entered a room. She had dismissed it as her own paranoia, a side effect of loneliness. "He should be home any minute, Thomas." "Thank you." Her voice sounded breezy, false to her own ears. Camille stepped out, her Louboutins sinking slightly into the pristine gravel. The house, a masterpiece of modern architecture, she had spent 2 years helping design, rose before her. It was all glass and white stone, and clean lines, a physical manifestation of their shared vision of a perfect ordered life. But today, a profound, unnatural silence emanated from it. Usually the house hummed with activity, the clatter of pans from the kitchen where the chef Jean-Pierre would be creating magic, the distant hum of a vacuum as the housekeeper Maria erased any trace of imperfection. Maria, she called out, her voice swallowed by the cavernous, echoing foyer. A massive Dial Chihuly sculpture, their first major art purchase, hung from the two-story ceiling. Its glass tendrils, a riot of cobalt blue and fiery orange, glittered like frozen fireworks. No answer. Her heart gave a little trip. A folded note on the polished marble console table next to a vase of fresh lilies caught her eye. It was Maria's neat, cursive script. Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Hartley gave the staff the remainder of the day off to honor your anniversary. He said he was planning a private evening for the two of you and wanted complete privacy. Maria, a small, hopeful smile touched Camille's lips, chasing away some of the creeping anxiety. Richard, for all his recent coldness, the grand romantic gestures were still his trademark. He'd done this on their 10th anniversary, whisking her away to Paris on a private jet with an hour's notice. Perhaps she had been overthinking things, letting the pressures of his empire cloud her judgment. A private evening. It was exactly what they needed. A chance to reconnect, to find their way back to the kitchen table where it had all begun. Feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in months, she carried the precious gift and ascended the floating glass staircase, her heels clicking softly. Their master suite, her personal sanctuary, occupied the entire west wing of the house overlooking the formal gardens. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. A soft, feminine hum, a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment drifted out. It wasn't Maria's voice. It wasn't a voice she recognized at all. Camille's heart began a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of dread. She told herself it was a masseuse he'd hired, or a stylist, an innocent explanation. Her hand, suddenly clammy, pushed the door open, and the world stopped turning. It simply ceased to exist. The room was flooded with the buttery, golden light of the setting sun, and standing in the center of it, as if she were the star of a play, and this was her stage, was a woman. She was younger than Camille, perhaps in her late 20s, with a waterfall of raven black hair cascading over her shoulders, and a lithe, slender figure that seemed poured into the dress she was wearing. But it wasn't the woman herself who made the air leave Camille's lungs in a silent, suffocating scream. It was what she was wearing. It was Camille's wedding dress, the ivory silk Vera Wang gown, with its delicate hand-stitched lace bodice, and a train that had pulled around her feet like liquid moonlight 15 years ago. A dress she had meticulously preserved in a temperature-controlled, acid-free garment bag. A sacred object, a memory made tangible, a symbol of every vow they had made. The woman turned a slow, deliberate movement, as if she had been waiting for her audience. She had stunning, cat-like green eyes and full crimson-painted lips that curved into a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. She ran a hand down the silk of the bodice, her touch a brazen violation, a proprietary caress. She held herself not with the awkwardness of someone playing dress-up, but with the chilling, absolute certainty of ownership. Camille's mind fractured into a million pieces. This had to be a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination. Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice a fragile, broken thing, a piece of shattered glass. "What are you doing in my dress?" The woman, whose name she would later learn was Isabella, didn't answer right away. She admired her own reflection, turning slightly to see how the train fell. "It's beautiful," she said finally, her voice smooth as velvet, dripping with condescension. "A true classic, though the waist needed to be taken in quite a bit. You must have been holding your breath all day." The casual, pointed cruelty of the remark was like a physical blow. It was designed to diminish her, to render her a less perfect version. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in Camille's throat. The Tiffany's box, her symbol of hope and history, slipped from her numb fingers and landed on the plush white carpet with a soft, muffled thud. "Get out," Camille said, her voice shaking but gaining a sliver of steel forged in pure shock. "Get out of my house." Isabella laughed, a sound that was both musical and mocking. "I think you should take that up with Richard," she purred. This was his idea, after all. As if summoned by a demonic incantation, the sound of the front door opening and closing echoed from the vast foyer below. Heavy, confident footsteps, Richard's footsteps, a sound that had once been the ultimate comfort, ascended the stairs. Camille's head snapped toward the doorway, her heart pounding with a terrifying cocktail of dread and a sliver of desperate, pathetic hope. Hope that this was all a monstrous misunderstanding, that he would walk in, take one look at this scene, and throw this imposter out his face a mask of rage and apology, that he would rush to her and hold her and tell her she was crazy for even thinking the worst. Richard appeared in the doorway. He was still devastatingly handsome, his dark hair lightly salted with grey at the temples, his bespoke suit perfectly tailored to his athletic frame. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the tableau, Camille pale and trembling, her face a canvas of disbelief and pain. The Tiffany's box lying forgotten on the floor, and Isabella standing proudly in the sacred gown, a twisted parody of a bride. He looked at Camille, and his blue eyes were as cold and flat as a winter sky. There was no shock, no guilt, no remorse. There was only a weary, profound impatience, as if she were an annoying interruption to his meticulously planned afternoon. "Camille," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any emotion. "You're home early." "Richard, what is this?" she choked out, gesturing with a trembling hand at Isabella, who was now smiling at him with an adoring, possessive gaze. "Who is this woman? For the love of God, why is she wearing my wedding dress? Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Richard's eyes moved from Camille's anguished face to Isabella. A silent communication passed between them. He walked over to Isabella, his expensive leather shoes silent on the carpet. He stood behind her, placing his hands on her waist, on the hallowed silk of Camille's dress. He looked at their reflection in the antique Parisian mirror, then his eyes met Camille's through the glass, a cold, final judgment. He adjusted the fit of the bodice on Isabella's frame, his movements intimate, practiced, proprietary. Then he leaned in and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to the base of her neck. Camille felt the last vestiges of her world, the foundations of her life and her identity, crumble to dust. The sound in her ears was like a rushing wind, blocking out everything but the frantic beating of her own heart. "Richard, no," she begged, the word, a prayer to a God who had long since abandoned the building. A single tear finally broke free and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. He finally turned his full attention back to her, his expression curdling into one of utter disdain. He looked her up and down, from her sensible, elegant dress to her tear-streaked face. Then he let loose the words that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life, words forged in the very fires of hell, designed for maximum destruction. He shrugged, a small dismissive gesture, as if commenting on the weather. "Honestly, Camille," he said, a cruel, lazy smile playing on his lips. "She wears it better." The 5 words hung in the air, more violent than a gunshot, more destructive than a bomb. She wears it better. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict, an erasure of 15 years of shared history, of whispered secrets, in the dark, of holding his hand in hospital waiting rooms and celebrating on trading floors. It was a declaration that Camille herself, the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing but a brilliant idea and a mountain of debt, was now an obsolete model inferior to the newer, sleeker version he had acquired. For a long, terrifying moment, Camille couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to a suffocating tunnel, the only things in focus being Richard's smug, triumphant face, and Isabella's reflection glowing with victory in the Parisian mirror. A primal scream built in her chest, a raw, wounded sound of a soul being torn apart. It clawed its way up her throat, but when it reached her lips, it died. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not collapse into a hysterical heap on the floor of her own bedroom while her husband's mistress preened in her wedding dress. The last shred of her pride, a tiny, resilient thread, refused to snap. With a calmness that felt utterly alien, as if she were a spectator watching a stranger inhabit her own body, Camille bent down. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost graceful. She picked up the Tiffany's box. The weight of it in her hand was no longer a promise, but an anchor to a life that had just sunk to the bottom of the sea. She straightened up, holding the gift that had only minutes ago been a symbol of enduring love. Now it was a relic from a dead civilization. She met Richard's cold, expectant eyes. He was waiting for the explosion, the tears, the recriminations. She gave him none of it. "Happy anniversary," she said, her voice eerily steady, devoid of inflection. Then she turned and walked out of the room. She didn't run. Her back was straight, her head held high. She walked down the floating glass staircase, each step a conscious, painful act of will. She walked through the grand foyer, past the Chihuly sculpture that now looked like a frozen scream. She walked out the massive front door, leaving it wide open, a gaping wound in the face of her home. She didn't look back. Looking back would have broken her. She got into her Range Rover, the familiar smell of leather and safety now feeling like a lie. She started the engine, the powerful roar a welcome sound in the crushing silence. And she drove. She drove away from the estate, away from the life she had built, the setting sun, a blood-red smear in her rearview mirror. She had no destination. She just drove. The pristine, tree-lined roads of Greenwich, Connecticut, a place that had always felt like a safe, manicured paradise, now seemed sinister and suffocating. The faces of their friends, their neighbors, the people who saw the perfect couple, the Hartleys, flashed in her mind. Had they known? Had they seen Richard with Isabella at some charity gala or a private club and looked the other way? Complicit in their silence, the humiliation burned hotter than the grief. A memory surfaced at a recent dinner party. Her friend Caroline had made a strange comment, asking if Richard was happy. At the time, Camille had thought it was an odd question. Now, it felt like a veiled warning. Her hands, slick with a cold sweat, gripped the steering wheel. Her phone, which she'd left on the passenger seat, began to ring its cheerful chime, a jarring counterpoint to the chaos in her soul. Richard's name and picture flashed on the screen. She ignored it. It rang again, and again. Then a text. "Camille, pick up the phone. You're overreacting." Then another. "This is not what it looks like. Let's be adults about this." The gaslighting had already begun. He wasn't sorry. He was annoyed that his sixth celebratory game had been interrupted. Finally, her fingers trembling, she tapped the screen and put the phone on speaker, intending to tell him to go to hell. But it wasn't Richard. It was her best friend, Chloe Chang. "Elle, where are you? I've been calling. I was just about to leave for your anniversary dinner reservation at Per Se. Don't tell me you forgot." Chloe's voice was warm, cheerful, and achingly normal. It was the sound of the world that had existed just an hour ago, and it was the sound that finally broke the dam. A sob ripped from Camille's chest, a sound of such profound pain that it barely sounded human. It was the sound of 15 years of love and trust dying a violent death. "Chloe," she gasped, swerving to pull the car over onto the shoulder of the Merritt Parkway. I need you. My God. Elle, what is it? What's wrong? Are you okay? Where are you?" Chloe's voice was instantly sharp with concern. "I'm just driving. He has someone. He had her in our bedroom, Chloe." She had to pause to force the next words out. "He had her in my wedding dress." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a silence so thick with fury she could feel it through the phone. Chloe Chang was not just Camille's friend from their days at Columbia Law. She was one of the most feared divorce attorneys in New York City. Her loyalty was absolute, and her wrath, when provoked on behalf of someone she loved, was a thing of legal legend. "That son of a bitch," Chloe said, her voice losing all its warmth, replaced by the iciest, most dangerous calm. "That narcissistic, sociopathic son of a bitch. Okay, listen to me, Camille. Stop driving. Are you pulled over?" "Yes." "Good. Drive to my apartment. Do not go to a hotel. Do not use your credit cards for anything. Do not call him back. Drive straight to my place in the city. I'll meet you there. I'm leaving my office now. And Camille, listen to me. Don't you dare blame yourself for 1 second. This is not about you. This is about him being a monster. Do you understand?" "I understand," Camille whispered, though she didn't believe it. The words "she wears it better" were on a torturous, venomous loop in her head. An hour later, numb and disoriented, Camille was buzzed into Chloe's sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking Central Park. Chloe enveloped her in a hug, holding her tight as the shudders racked her body. She led Camille to a plush sofa, wrapped her in a heavy cashmere blanket, and handed her a glass of what looked like very expensive scotch. Chloe was already in battle mode. Her own phone was pressed to her ear as she paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering city lights a backdrop to her fury. "That's right," he cited, "a potential mental health crisis," she snarled into the phone. She was talking to a junior associate at her firm. Unbelievable. The nerve of this guy. He's already building his narrative, the hysterical, unstable wife. Check the joint accounts again. All of them. She hung up and turned to Camille, her face grim. "He's frozen everything. The joint, checking the investment portfolio, even the Amex Centurion card in your name. He's not just ending a marriage, Elle. He's trying to obliterate you. He wants to leave you with nothing. No money, no credibility, no dignity. He wants to paint you as crazy so no one will believe a word you say." Camille stared into the amber liquid in her glass. "Our children, Leo and Sophia. They're coming home from boarding school for the weekend. He'll get to them first. He'll poison them against me." Leo, at 17, idolized his father. He was already enamored with the power and trappings of the Hartley name. Sophia, at 16, was more like Camille, sensitive, intuitive, and possessed of a fierce moral compass. "We call them now," Chloe said, handing Camille her phone. "Before he does." With trembling fingers, Camille FaceTimed Sophia. Her daughter's bright smiling face appeared on the screen, instantly replaced by a look of concern. "Mum, are you okay? You look... Why are you at Aunt Chloe's? Did something happen?" Camille's composure crumbled again. Through her tears, stumbling over the horrific words, she explained the bare, brutal facts. She saw the horror and disbelief dawn on Sophia's face, her eyes filling with tears in solidarity and rage. "He did what Sophia whispered. I'm on the next train home, Mum. I'll come straight to Chloe's. I'm with you." The call with Leo was different. He listened, his handsome face, so like his father's, hardening into a mask of skepticism. "A woman in your dress?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Mom, are you sure Dad said you've been under a lot of stress lately, that you've been imagining things? Maybe you misunderstood." The words were a knife in her heart, twisting with Richard's poison. He had already laid the groundwork, subtly planting seeds of doubt about her mental state for weeks, even months. "Leo, I know what I saw," Camille said, her voice pleading. "Your father is with another woman. I'll call Dad," he said, his voice cold and distant. He hung up before she could say another word. Camille dropped the phone as if it were on fire. He hadn't just turned her son against her, he had used her own love and concern as the weapon. Chloe knelt in front of her, taking both of Camille's hands in her own. "Camille, look at me. This is the fight of your life. He has money, he has power, and he has no conscience. He will burn the world down to win. We can't play defense. We have to attack. We have to be smarter. We have to be more ruthless. We need leverage. Something he can't control, something he can't buy his way out of." "What leverage could I possibly have?" Camille asked, her voice hollow. "He owns everything. He is everything." Chloe's eyes, usually so warm, were now sharp and calculating, the eyes of a predator. "You were there from the beginning. L. Hartley Innovations wasn't born in a boardroom. It was born at your kitchen table. You were on the board for the first 5 years. You were in every meeting. You typed his notes, you helped draft the business plan, you talked him off the ledge a dozen times. His empire wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built on a foundation you helped lay. Men like Richard, men who get that rich that fast, they don't do it cleanly. They cut corners, they make enemies, they hide things. Somewhere in the foundations of that empire, there is a crack, a dark secret he thinks is long buried. And we are going to find it. Your memory, Camille, your knowledge of how it all began, that is our fortress. And from inside it we will wage this war. A flicker of something that wasn't despair ignited in Camille's chest. It was a tiny, fragile spark, but it was there. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "He called me hysterical," Camille said softly, remembering the excuse to freeze her credit cards. "Good," Chloe said with a grim smile. "Let him think that. Let him underestimate you. Let him think you're at home, crying into a pillow, a broken, hysterical woman. He won't see us coming." The days that followed were a disorienting, suffocating blur of legal strategy and emotional survival. Chloe's immaculate apartment, once a place of laughter and long lunches, transformed into a war room. Whiteboards were covered in a spiderweb of corporate structures, timelines, and names. Boxes of documents retrieved from a storage unit Camille had kept since her pre-marriage days by a trusted paralegal were piled high on the dining table. These were relics from the genesis of Hartley Innovations, a time when Camille was not just the wife, but a founding partner in all but name, her handwriting on half the early business plans. Richard, as predicted, launched a scorched earth offensive. His lawyers, a pack of legal sharks from a notoriously aggressive firm, filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and erratic and unstable behavior on Camille's part. He weaponized their social circle, leaking carefully curated stories to gossip columns and influential bloggers about Camille's instability and increasing paranoia. The narrative was skillful and cruel. Richard, the long-suffering husband, finally forced to seek solace elsewhere from his volatile, unhinged wife. He was positioning himself as the victim. He sent Leo to the apartment once. It was a disastrous, painful meeting where her son, her firstborn, repeated his father's talking points like a programmed machine. "Dad said you're being vindictive, Mom," Leo had said, his eyes cold, refusing to meet hers. "He said you're just trying to ruin him because he found happiness. He said you should take the generous offer and move on." Sophia, however, was her rock, her guardian angel. She arrived from school with a small suitcase and an inferno in her eyes, moving into Chloe's guest room without a second thought. She became a fierce, protective shield for her mother. She screened calls, intercepted manipulative texts from Richard, made tea, and sat with Camille late into the night, holding her hand as she sifted through stacks of old files, her young face a mask of quiet, determined fury. "We'll get him, Mom," she would whisper. "We will." The central obstacle, Chloe explained as they pored over documents one night, was the prenuptial agreement. It was an ironclad fortress of legal protection Richard's ruthless attorneys had drafted when he was on the cusp of his first major breakthrough. In the intoxicating haze of love and boundless optimism, Camille had signed it without much thought, believing it was a formality they'd laugh about in their old age. Now, its clauses were like prison bars. In the event of a divorce, she was entitled to a one-time payment of $5 million and the Greenwich house, which in a rare moment of sentimentality, Richard had put in her name. It was a fortune to most, but it was less than 1% of his estimated $2 billion net worth. It was a settlement designed to silence her, to make her go away quietly and gratefully. The prenup is valid unless we can prove duress or fraudulent disclosure at the time of signing, which is nearly impossible to do 15 years later, Chloe said, tapping a pen against her chin. Or, if we can prove criminal activity on his part that put marital assets at risk. If we can prove he's a crook, that the foundation of his wealth is rotten, a judge might be willing to throw the whole damn thing out. The unclean hands doctrine. This became their singular mission, to find the crime, to find the rot. Camille closed her eyes, forcing herself back, in time, past the pain and betrayal to the early days. Back to their cramped apartment in Queens, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and ambition. Back to the late nights hunched over a second-hand laptop, brainstorming names, designing logos, mapping out a future that seemed impossibly bright. There was something, Camille said slowly, her eyes snapping open. A project. It was very early on, right before the first big round of VC funding. He called it Project Chimera. Chloe leaned forward, her interest peaked. What was it? I never fully understood it. That was the point. It was the one thing he was completely secretive about, which was unusual for him back then. He told me it was a revolutionary data compression algorithm. He worked on it exclusively with one developer, a brilliant, quiet man named Julian Croft. They were inseparable for about 6 months. Then one day, the project was just gone. Richard said they'd hit a dead end, that the tech was unstable, and he'd scrapped it. Julian left the company very suddenly right after. Richard told me he'd had a nervous breakdown and moved upstate to recover. A nervous breakdown or a golden handshake to keep his mouth shut, Chloe mused, already moving to the whiteboard. She scribbled the name Julian Croft and Project Chimera in bold red marker. Let's find him, and let's look for this project. Richard is meticulous and arrogant. He probably never thought anyone would look this deep. A trace of it must exist somewhere. They assembled a small, loyal team. Chloe brought in a forensic IT specialist, a quiet, intense woman named Anya, who could work magic with code. While Anya began the painstaking needle-in-a-haystack search for a digital ghost on old company servers and backups, Chloe put her best private investigator on the case. Sal, a gruff ex-cop with more sources than a newspaper, was tasked with finding the reclusive Julian Croft. Days turned into a week, then 2. The legal pressure from Richard's team was immense. They sent lowball offers, each one a calculated insult. They subpoenaed Camille's friends, trying to dig up dirt to isolate her further. Through it all, Camille focused channeling her pain into the search. She spent hours poring over old financial statements, her architect's eye for detail, seeking a pattern, an anomaly she might have missed. And then she found it. Late one night, her eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, she saw it. A series of 5 wire transfers from early 2008, the exact period when Project Chimera was scrapped. Each transfer was for $50,000 sent from a Hartley Innovations subsidiary to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands called Serpent Data Systems. It wasn't a huge amount for a company of that size, but it was off the books. It was structured to avoid reporting requirements. It was hidden. At almost the same moment, Sal called. He had found Julian Croft. He wasn't living in a mansion on a beach, enjoying his early retirement. He was living in a modest, rundown apartment in Albany, working as a high school computer science teacher. He had refused to talk to Sal, but Sal had noted something crucial. The man was terrified. He looked at me like I was the ghost of Christmas past, Sal reported, his voice gravelly. This guy is hiding from something or someone. When I mentioned Richard Hartley's name, he literally slammed the door in my face. Let me talk to him, Camille insisted immediately. He won't talk to a lawyer or an investigator. He'll see them as a threat. But he might talk to me. He'll remember me. We used to have coffee together in the break room. Chloe was hesitant, fearing for Camille's safety, but she saw the steel in her friend's eyes. This was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled into her apartment a few weeks ago. This was a woman on a mission. Accompanied by Sal, who waited in an unmarked car down the street, Camille knocked on the peeling paint of Julian Croft's apartment door. The man who answered was a ghost himself, a gaunt shadow of the ambitious young developer she remembered. He was thin, his hair prematurely gray, and his eyes darted nervously around the hallway before landing on her. Recognition and then pure panic dawned on his face. "Camille," he whispered, shocked. "What are you doing here? You can't be here." "I need your help, Julian," she said softly, keeping her voice calm and steady. "I need you to tell me about Project Chimera." Fear, stark and absolute, washed over his face. "I can't. I signed an NDA, a confidentiality agreement thicker than a phone book. He'll ruin me. He told me he would destroy my life if I ever spoke of it." "He's already trying to ruin mine," Camille replied, her voice steady and clear. "He left me Julian for another woman. He's trying to take my children, my home, my name, everything. I know he paid you. I found the transfers to Serpent Data Systems. What was it, Julian? What was he paying you to forget?" Julian Croft looked past her at the quiet suburban street, as if expecting Richard's black sedans to appear at any moment. He hesitated, his hands trembling. He was about to close the door when he looked back at Camille's face, at the quiet desperation and shared trauma in her eyes. Something inside him, some long-suppressed sense of decency, finally broke. He pulled her inside and quickly locked the door. "It wasn't a compression software," he said, his voice barely a whisper, even in the safety of his own home. That was the cover story. It was a key, a digital skeleton key. It was a piece of malware designed to exploit a zero-day security flaw in the core software of our biggest competitor back then, a company called Atherton Dynamics. It wouldn't just crash their system, it would copy their entire client database, their intellectual property portfolio, everything, without leaving a digital fingerprint. It was corporate espionage on a scale I couldn't even fathom. Camille felt a chill creep down her spine. "Did you use it?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, I built the tool, but I got scared. It was blatantly illegal. It was a felony. I told Richard I wanted out, that I was going to destroy the code. He changed. He offered me money. When I refused, he threatened me. He had somehow found out about my younger brother's gambling debts to some very dangerous people. He said he could make it all go away, or he could make one phone call and send them to collect. He had me trapped." Julian's voice cracked. "So I built the final deployment module, gave him the master file, and he paid me $250,000 through that shell company to disappear and never speak of it again. He called it the ghost file, because it was meant to haunt Atherton forever without them ever knowing it was there." Atherton Dynamics. The company had collapsed spectacularly a year later in the fall of 2009. The official story in the financial press was a catastrophic server failure combined with bad investments made during the financial crisis. Their charismatic CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his fortune. "He used it." Camille breathed the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Richard used the ghost file and destroyed them. His first big government contract, the one that put Hartley Innovations on the map, it was with Atherton's biggest client. He didn't win it, he stole it." Back in the car, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and vindication, Camille called Chloe. "I have it," she said, her voice trembling with the enormity of the discovery. "I have the crime." As she spoke, her other phone, a burner phone Chloe had insisted she get for secure communication, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her hands shaking, she opened it. The message was short, cryptic, and sent a jolt of ice through her veins. "He's not who you think he is. He's dangerous. Neither of us are safe. Be careful." Camille stared at the message, her blood running cold. There was no signature, but she knew. She knew with absolute bone-chilling certainty who had sent it. Isabella. Isabella's text message was a paradigm shift. It changed the board entirely. She wasn't just a triumphant mistress. She was a co-conspirator who had realized her partner was a monster. She was a prisoner in the gilded cage she had so eagerly helped to build. Richard's cruelty, Camille realized with a chilling certainty, was not a characteristic reserved for her alone. He was a user, a controller, and Isabella, the shiny new prize, was now on the receiving end of his suffocating paranoia. She was an asset that was rapidly becoming a liability, and Richard Hartley did not tolerate liabilities. "This is our Trojan horse," Chloe said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, strategic light as she stared at the burner phone. "She's terrified. He's probably locked down her finances, tracking her every move, isolating her from her friends. It's the same pattern he used on you, his standard operating procedure for control. She's the insider we need. She can corroborate Julian's story, and more importantly, she can tell us what Richard is planning now. Getting to Isabella was a high-stakes challenge. Sal, the investigator, managed to establish a secure, indirect line of communication using a cutout, a friend of Isabella's from her yoga studio, who was actually one of Sal's operatives. The story that emerged, piece by painful piece, was grim. Richard had promised her the world, but had delivered a beautifully decorated, inescapable prison. He was possessive, wildly jealous, and prone to terrifying rages over imagined slights. The sadistic performance in the wedding dress hadn't been her idea. It had been his. He had meticulously orchestrated the entire scene, coaching her on what to say, how to stand, all for the purpose of inflicting the maximum possible psychological pain on Camille. Isabella, blinded by the glamour and what she mistook for love, had been a willing participant. But the reality of being Richard's chosen one was a horror show of control and emotional abuse. She was now genuinely scared for her life. Through her contact, Isabella revealed Richard's endgame. He wasn't just moving money, he was preparing to vanish. He had been systematically liquidating assets, moving vast sums of money through a complex, untraceable network of offshore accounts, the same network that had begun with Serpent data systems all those years ago. His plan was to crush Camille in the divorce proceedings, leave her with the pittance from the prenup, and then move with Isabella to a non-extradition country. He planned to disappear, a modern-day Gatsby with a stolen fortune and a beautiful accessory, leaving the ruins of his former life behind. The final critical piece of the puzzle came from Anya, the forensic IT specialist. After weeks of searching through terabytes of archived data, she found it. Buried deep in an old server, scheduled for destruction, mislabeled as legacy marketing data, and triple encrypted, was a file folder named Chimera. And inside it, pristine and damning, was the ghost file, the elegant, malicious code Julian Croft had built. More importantly, there were logs. Undeleted, time-stamped, irrefutable system logs that showed the code being deployed against Atherton Dynamics' servers on November 15, 2008. The logs also showed a massive multi-terabyte data transfer out Atherton's entire R&D portfolio and client list to a secure, anonymous Hartley Innovations server. They had him. It was the smoking gun. It was the digital DNA of the crime that had been the cornerstone of his entire empire. "It's time," Chloe said, a grimly satisfied smile on her face. "No more offers, no more negotiations. This is unconditional surrender." Camille felt a strange, profound calm settle over her. The grief was still there, a dull, permanent ache in her bones, but it was now overlaid with a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about a broken heart and a desecrated wedding dress. It was about justice. Justice for Julian Croft, whose life had been derailed by fear. Justice for Marcus Thorne of Atherton Dynamics, who had been publicly ruined. And justice for the woman she used to be, the bright-eyed, trusting woman who had poured her soul into building a dream, with a man who was a lie. She requested the meeting, not with his army of lawyers, but with him, alone. He agreed immediately, his arrogance so profound that he likely assumed she was finally crawling back to beg for scraps. He suggested their home, her home, as the venue. She refused. The thought of setting foot in that house again made her physically ill. Instead, she chose the location, the empty, sterile boardroom of a downtown office building Chloe had access to on a Saturday. A place with no memories. Neutral ground for a declaration of war. Camille walked in, not as a victim, but as a general. She wore a sharp, tailored suit of her own, a deep charcoal grey, the armor of her reclaimed identity. Richard was already there, standing by the vast floor-to-ceiling window, looking down on the city he believed he owned. He turned as she entered, a smug, patronizing smile on his handsome face. He looked relaxed, confident, utterly in control. "Camille," he began, his voice smooth and condescending. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. My offer is still on the table. It's more than generous. Take it, and you can live comfortably for the rest of your life." Camille didn't say a word. She walked to the long, polished mahogany boardroom table and placed a single thick file folder in its center. "Project Chimera," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing slightly in the vast, empty room. Richard's smile faltered. A flicker of confusion, then palpable alarm, crossed his face. "I don't know what you're talking about. That was a failed project from over a decade ago." "I spoke to Julian Croft." Camille continued, her gaze unwavering, pinning him in place. "He lives in Albany now, teaches high school computer science. He remembers everything, Richard. The skeleton key, the shell company, the threats against his family. He remembers building the ghost file." The color drained from Richard's face. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, truly shaken. "He's a disgruntled ex-employee, a nobody with a history of mental instability. It's his word against mine." "It's not just his word," Camille said, using her index finger to slide the folder across the polished table toward him. "It's also this." He opened it. His hands, she noted with grim satisfaction, were beginning to tremble. Inside were the printouts arranged in a neat, undeniable narrative of his crime. The wire transfers to Serpent data systems. The time-stamped server logs showing the infiltration of Atherton Dynamics. A sworn, notarized affidavit from Julian Croft detailing the entire conspiracy. And on top of it all, a printed transcript of a text message conversation. Richard stared at the transcript, his breath catching in his throat. It was a conversation between him and a financial contact in Dubai, discussing the final liquidation of his U.S. assets and his imminent relocation. The messages had been forwarded to Sal by Isabella 5 hours ago. She had chosen her side. He whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and impotent rage. "The ungrateful bitch. After everything I gave her, she gave this to you." "It turns out," Camille said, the corner of her mouth twitching in a mirthless smile, "that you're not a very nice person to be in a relationship with. She was afraid of what you'd do to her when she was no longer useful. I can't say I blame her. That seems to be your pattern." Richard sank into one of the expensive leather chairs, his multi-billion-dollar empire, his carefully constructed universe, crumbling around him in the space of a few heartbeats. He looked up at her, the arrogance and condescension completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic pleading she had never seen before. "Camille, what do you want? Money you can have half, 60%. Just don't release this, please." Camille looked at the man she had loved, the father of her children, the man who had built a world with her and then tried to burn her out of it. She felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. "It's not about the money anymore, Richard," she said softly. "It was never just about the money. It was about respect. It was about our life. The life you spit on when you put that woman in my wedding dress and told me she wore it better." She stood up, her part in this drama finished. "My lawyers will be in touch with yours. We will not be accepting the terms of the prenup. We will be drafting a new settlement. It will be fair. It will be just. And you will sign it. Because if you don't, this folder—" She patted the folder on the table. goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC. Your choice: a quiet, costly divorce or a very public, life-destroying felony conviction. She walked to the door, her steps confident and light. "Camille waits," he cried out, his voice the sound of a broken man in a bespoke suit. "Don't do this." She paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "You know Richard?" she said, looking out the window at the city skyline. "For 15 years I helped you build your world. Now I'm going to build my own." She walked out, leaving him alone with the evidence of his ruin. The fallout was swift and catastrophic for him. Faced with certain prosecution, Richard agreed to a settlement that was staggering. It wasn't about cash, it was about dismantling his power. Camille, guided by Chloe, took controlling interest in several of his legitimate subsidiary companies, including a high-end real estate development firm he'd started as a vanity project. The Greenwich house was hers, free and clear. Leo and Sophia, confronted with the undeniable black-and-white proof of their father's crimes and cruelty, finally saw him for who he was. Leo came to her, his face streaked with tears, and apologized, the beginning of a long, painful healing process for them both. Richard Hartley, the titan of industry, vanished from the public eye, his empire dismantled, his legacy forever tainted. Isabella, in exchange for her cooperation, was left with a fraction of what she'd been promised and a life she had to rebuild from the ashes of her own ambition. 6 months later, Camille stood, not in a boardroom, but on a dusty construction site in Brooklyn, a white hard hat on her head and a set of blueprints in her hand. She had sold the Greenwich house, a beautiful monument, to a terrible lie, and used the proceeds to fund her new life. She had restarted her architecture firm, taking over one of the companies from the settlement and rebranding it. Her first project was a multi-use community building featuring affordable housing, a public library, and green rooftop space. Sophia was at her side, interning for the summer, her face bright with admiration. The sun was warm on Camille's face. She looked at the steel skeleton rising against the bright blue sky, a structure born not of theft and ego, but of purpose and passion. She was no longer just Camille Hartley, the billionaire's wife. She was Camille Hartley, architect, creator, survivor. She was wearing her own crown now, and it fit perfectly. Camille's story is a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest warriors. She lost a husband, but she found herself. She was faced with the ultimate humiliation, but she turned her pain into power, not just for revenge, but for reclamation. Her victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in rebuilding her life on her own terms with integrity and purpose. What did you think of Camille's journey from heartbreak to triumph? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story of resilience and justice moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.